want to do some controversial statements later, and that goes over better if you understand who makes them in the first place. Especially if you understand that I've been working with standards and being pretty fascinated by standards for a very long time. So when I tell you that they don't work, I have a reason to say so. So my background is, and this is probably different from a lot of people that are at this conference, my background is mostly on the print side of things. I've been introduced to PDF as far back as 1996, when PDF first became a format that was usable in print, in graphic arts. And I've been working with that ever since. So if you are in graphic arts or you have done anything there, then names like Enfocus and their pit stop product should be familiar. Gradual probably is not, but Switch, which is now an Enfocus automation product, should be. So I've been working on PDF editing, I've been working on PDF quality control since the moment that it started becoming usable for graphic arts. I was also involved, and it was interesting to hear some of the history yesterday, I was also involved with PDFX and PDFX development even before the stage that it went to ISO. There was an organization in the US, DDAP, that was concerned with the publication and the transmission of advertisements for publication in magazines and newspapers. And they were one of the groups that started pushing for a quality standard around the use of PDF for advertisements. Same thing in Europe in many ways. The Ghent Workgroup started working around the exchange of PDF files, again for publication in magazines and newspaper, and commercial print in general, if you want. Around the same time as DDAP did that in the US. And that culminated on the US side in PDFX 1A, in ISO standard, and on the European side, or part of the European side actually, it culminated in the development of the Ghent Workgroup itself, and the existence of the Ghent Workgroup as an international organization that works around standards. And I will say more about that a little bit later. At the moment, I'm CTO at 4Ps, which is a distributor of software in the graphic art space and an integrator in the graphic art space. And I am also executive director of the Ghent Workgroup at the moment. I'm co-chair of the specification subcommittee. I'm co-chair of some other subcommittee that is less relevant for this talk. But the specification subcommittee is very relevant. This is the group that develops the standards that we work on the Ghent Workgroup side. So that's a little bit of the history. I also have a slight fascination with penguins, which I'm told is not dangerous, but you'll see some of them pass by. So what are we talking about? And I could have done this session, and this was the original thought, I could have done this session and just talked about what is new in the Ghent Workgroup 2022 specifications, and then probably most of you would have had no clue what I was talking about, because it would have been very technical and well, if you don't know what the old specifications do, or what specifications do in general, then the difference with what we do now is maybe not so relevant. So I chose to go different routes, and I included this slide because I think it's very important. I'm talking about graphic arts here, about print, publishing, anything that has to do with anything that you have on paper or packaging, the cups that are printed that you have here, the banners that you can see, all of that stuff. And the importance of realizing that we're in graphic arts, and the difference perhaps with some other market segments, is the diversity of what you see. We're not just talking about things on paper. We could be talking about probably some of the stuff that you have on the floor is printed. Things that you have on the wall could be printed. Yeah? The diversity of this market is really, really big. And then you could say, yes, but if you look at PDF-A or you look at PDF-UA, then the diversity of the things that we have there is also very big. The question is whether that diversity is important for the standards development or not. And I think there the graphic arts market is a little bit special in the sense that the differences between what you need in a standard from product to product are really very high. And I'll come back on that. And so the products are very diverse. The technologies that are used to print all of these things are very diverse as well. And they come with their own set of difficulties and limitations. So that's kind of the backdrop of the market segment. On the other hand, and there was already a lot of talk about this, so I can be pretty brief about it. On the other hand, you have standards in that market, and there are two big areas there. On the one hand, ISO, and you heard talk about PDFX, PDFVT, PDFVCR. There is a whole bunch more, but those are probably the most important ones in the graphic arts segment. And then on the other hand, you have Ghent Workgroup. I think most of you probably understand by now what ISO is and have at least some understanding of what might work and might not work in the ISO process also after some of the sessions yesterday. The Ghent Workgroup was founded in a little bit of a different way. First of all, it is much smaller. It was more of an ad hoc group of people that came together and said, we need to come up with something here because we have a problem. And so the Ghent Workgroup does not have this rigorous process that you see on the ISO side. And that has advantages and disadvantages. The big advantage is that we can be much more flexible. We can essentially do whatever we feel like doing. The group is smaller. We don't have this process of having to go through validation with a whole bunch of countries that have their own opinion. No, we can essentially do whatever we want to do in our little corner. That's an advantage. You can be more agile and flexible. It's also a disadvantage because you don't have the additional quality control and the rigorousness that you have in the ISO process. But it is a different group altogether. It's also a group that from the very beginning was much more focused on today than tomorrow, where ISO has no problem developing a standard and then expecting the industry to grow to that standard. Ghent Workgroup has always had the opinion that if we build something today, it should be usable today as well. And that can be a little bit of a challenge. So the Ghent Workgroup in the graphic arts industry creates standards based on PDFX. So the basic stuff that you have in PDFX, the work that ISO does with defining this PDFX standard is absorbed, if you want. That is the baseline of what we do, and then things are built on top of that. And what is built on top of that is not just one standard. Well, we call it one standard, but it has different flavors, market segments. Variants is the term we typically use. So for the different types of technology, for the different products that we address, we develop substandards of our own, which has its own set of problems if you address it that way, but it does make for something that is slightly more powerful. So I'm going to make three statements that are perhaps controversial, although I was happy to hear the keynote yesterday, and maybe I don't have to explain that much that standards are badly constructed anymore. So point 3 is perhaps easier to understand. But I'm going to talk about three things. First of all, that in graphic arts, standards are irrelevant, and they are not completely, but I'll make the point, and you can disagree afterwards. That they are, even if they are relevant and used, that they are way too broad. And thirdly, that they are badly constructed. And it is the third point that is also going to lead to at least what we're doing now for the 2022 specifications and how that is different and perhaps slightly better, going in the right direction, I believe. So let's start with irrelevant. Printers don't care about standards. This is true much more so than in other segments, I believe. If you have an archive and you want to know what you're going to put in your archive, you're going to say, oh, we're going to follow a PDF standard. And then that PDF standard is going to tell you what you are allowed to do, what you are not allowed to do, and so on. In the case of PDF-A, it's an ISO standard, so you have all of these, thou shalt do this, thou shalt not do that, you should do this. You have a very formalized language on what you can do and what you cannot do. That's the purpose of all of these standards in the first place. And then the end result should be that the PDF file is fit for use. And so if I have an archive and I follow the PDF-A standard, the expectation is that my file is afterwards going to be archivable. I can actually put it in the archive and it's going to survive for a long time. And so if I have an archive, I'm going to insist that the files that are delivered to me follow that standard before I'm going to put them in the archive. Now, this is perhaps slightly different than what you see in graphic arts. If I am in graphic arts, I could say to my clients, I want you to deliver PDFX files. And if they do that, the file might be printable. I'll come back to that. It might be printable, it might be not. If they don't deliver me a PDFX file, the file might be printable and it might be not. So for printers, the main question that they ask when they receive stuff is not, does it follow the standard? The main question is, will it print? And while PDFX helps in that sense, it makes the chance that a file will print correctly higher than if it was not a PDFX file. It is by no means something that every printer really insists on. In fact, most printers, if you send a PDF file, they're already very happy that you don't send them something else. Even though the standard was developed exactly to be that, kind of a gatekeeper to say, you have to develop this. So do you need to be PDFX compliant? Do you need to be Ghent Workgroup compliant? If you talk to printers, you'll find that in many cases, they don't do any quality control against that at all. They might have, if they're good, they might have verbiage on their website, for example, that says, these are the standards that we follow, this is what we would like you to do when you send PDF files to us. But you'll see that if you then deliver files to them, the chance that they will actually check against the standard and tell you if you didn't follow the rules is actually pretty small. They'll just look at the file, they'll determine whether it's printable or not, and then they'll use it. And a very closely linked point to that is that even if the standards are used, they are so broad as to be unusable. And this is really true for PDFX, for example. Yeah? And if you look at this banner, I don't want to embarrass anyone, but if you look at this banner, it says PDFX, print without risk. Yeah, you wish. That's a completely false statement. Yeah? If you follow PDFX, the chance that something will be printable is higher. There is no arguing about that. But removing the risk by just following PDFX is a dream. For that, the graphic arts segment is way too broad. And remember, we're talking about all of these things. You cannot cover all of that with one standard. So again, one step back. If you think about what is the use of standards, well, the use of standards is to make a PDF file fit for use. And so PDF-A, well, PDF is good enough for long-term archival. PDF-UA, it can be used by accessibility software and so on. Yeah? And the same should go for graphic arts then with PDFX. However, you're looking at all of these things. And I picked out two examples. One, a highway billboard, so the big things you see next to the highway as you drive past them. We're in Germany, so you pass by them very fast. So they have to be big. And then on the other side, I picked out a photo book. But I could have chosen any two examples, essentially. And so we can look at one property of the product that you need in those two market segments. And the classic example is resolution. Resolution is the number of pixels per inch, dots per inch, depending on what you're looking at. So the number of pixels per inch that you have in an image before it is usable. And what does usable mean? Well, if you look at it and it looks completely pixelated, it's not usable. The resolution is too low. So we could look at these two products and say, well, we're going to make a standard. What should the standard say about resolution? If I print a photo book, nice paper, glossy paper, high quality, someone is going to read that under good lighting, not this, good lighting from a very close distance, you need quite high resolution in order to satisfy the customer. Anywhere from 150 to 300 dpi would do. So 300 pixels per inch in the images that you supply in your PDF file. If you look at the billboard, on the other hand, this is a huge file that you're going to need. But the resolution that those people are talking about is maybe 32 pixels per inch. That's more than sufficient. Why? Well, you're very far away from it. Your eyes will not be able to see more detail than that anyway. On top of that, you're very fast and it's gone. So the chance that you have to look at detail to see detail is not there. Yeah? So you don't need more detail than that. So now we're looking at creating one standard, PDFX, to cover something where I need 300 dpi on the one hand, and I need 30, maybe even less than that, dpi on the other hand. Yeah? And this is just one example. There are tens of different examples that you can give where the requirements are completely different for different parts of that market segment. So creating a PDFX standard that covers all of that is, well, it essentially requires you to make a standard that is very broad. Yeah? And so resolution is not covered by PDFX at all. So if I want to deliver a PDFX file and it has a resolution of 5 pixels per inch, then that will be a completely valid PDFX file. I can send it to my printer. He can pre-flight it against the PDFX standard, and the pre-flight will say, you did a splendid job, but when you print it, it will be unusable. So the standard is way too broad, and hence the fact that PDFX does not remove the risk. It brings the risk down. You're better sending off a PDFX file than sending off a regular PDF file that follows no standard at all. What the Ghent Workgroup did on top of that makes the situation a little bit better. Well, actually, it makes it substantially better, I think. Because the Ghent Workgroup has variants per market segment, at least in that set of standards, you're capable of saying, oh, the requirements that are defined here are when you are exchanging a PDF file that is going to be used as an advertisement in a magazine. That's one of the variants that we have. Another variant could be it's an advertisement, but not in a magazine, but in a newspaper. That's also one of the variants we have. Why? Because the two are already different, and they're significantly enough different that they required two sub-standards, if you want, two variants. So the Ghent Workgroup says we take everything that ISO gives us with PDFX and we put additional requirements on top of that. And because that is done, the usefulness of the standard improves quite a bit. However, you still have requirements that are not covered. If I send a PDF file for a business card, for example, the standard is not going to say anything about the size of the file that I send. So a printer will independently, after having checked that the file is Ghent Workgroup compliant, for example, will still have to check whether the PDF file has the right width and height in order to be printed on that business card. they still will have to verify that my PDF file contains 1 page if it's a single-sided business card, or 2 pages if it's a double-sided, because the standard doesn't say anything about number of pages in that PDF file. So even though we already have more requirements, and a lot more requirements when you look at the Ghent Workgroup specifications, there is still a lot of real business intelligence that is lacking, and that is not part of the standard, and that you have to check on a workflow basis, on a product basis, on a company basis. And so normally when I talk about this to printers, what you talk about is this pyramid, where you have PDF at the bottom, and then you have a slightly decreased level with PDFX. Some things are no longer allowed, but a lot is still allowed. And then you have the Ghent Workgroup specifications on top of that, where a lot more requirements are added. And then you have the individual company requirements that are the top of the pyramid, if you want. And if you want to do a good job in making sure that your file is suitable for print, you have to check all of those things. Okay, so last point. And like I said, I'm happy that I don't need to make the point as much anymore. Standards are badly constructed. And I will not talk about the ISO process in here, because that was done extensively, and also I don't feel responsible for it because I'm on the Ghent Workgroup side and we have enough problems there of our own. So I will talk about the Ghent Workgroup side for this. Yeah? And here is also where I will at least show you a little bit of the difference between what we used to do and what we have now come up with in the 2022 version of the specification, and why I think this is going in the right direction. The first thing is, and at the Ghent Workgroup this was a real pain point, is to make it very clear who is the audience of a standard. And of course you could say the audience is anyone who uses that standard, and in a philosophical way that is correct. If I go into an application, a pre-flight application, so quality control, then I'm going to select a profile, I'm going to check the file with that profile. So in a way I'm using that particular standard at that moment. But that does not mean that I have to understand all of the technical details of the standard. So the audience, when you look at the specification document, at the standard document, the audience of that document is not the people who are going to use it in the end, it is the people who have to work with it. And I listed some of the categories there. You have industry experts, you have software integrators, people who build workflows and automation in companies, you have educators who hopefully explain some of this stuff to future generations. These people need to have at least some technical understanding of the different requirements and what they entail and so on. It might not even mean that they have to understand everything, but they need some knowledge about the standards. And then the people who understand or need to understand the most probably is all of the technical people, and I say at vendors, but it could just as well be in companies that work in this space, but the people who need to build something around this standard. If I need to build software that creates PDF files following this standard, then yes, I need to understand all the details, all the bits and pieces. So that is one. And then what we used to do, and we've done this for many years, the Ghent Workgroup exists since about 2002, I believe, officially, but there was some work being done even before that. If you go back to those early days, the standards documents would have looked very similar to this. Yeah? So where ISO follows a very rigid layout and so on, as I said, the Ghent Workgroup could essentially do, or can essentially do, what we decide within the group to do. It is slightly less standardized, perhaps, or stringent. But still, we had a Word document. It was literally a Word document. And in that Word document, you have a list of requirements. And well, you can see them on the left-hand side there. The first requirement that we have in most of these Ghent Workgroup standards is ISO compliance, and that says which of the ISO standards are we following. So when you read this document, this is 2015, you would see that the ISO standard that this is built on top of is PDFX4. And so there is a long list of requirements, and remember that we have, in the Ghent Workgroup, that we have different variants. We have a variant for the magazine ads, we had a variant for newspaper ads, we will have something for sheet-fed offset printing, we now have something for digital print, we have things for packaging. So you have a long list of variants, and the way that the Ghent Workgroup deals with that, or dealt with that, was to have a Word document where first you have all the requirements, and then at the back of the document, you had a list of variants. And for each variant, it listed the requirements that were included in that particular variant. And that means, for example, that some of these requirements, and there is one that talks about number of pages in the list of requirements, for a magazine ad that is used, because normally an advertisement can only be one page. So that would show up in this list of that particular variant. If you look at something like digital print, you can't include it because, well, you can essentially print whatever you want. So in the digital print variant, that requirement would not appear. What is good about this is that it was a very short document to write. It's not very technically correct if you read through it. There is lots and lots of, if you think that there is lots of space for discussion in ISO documents, let me tell you that there was way more space for discussion in this document. So it was a pretty quickly written document, and quickly written documents are open for interpretation. Yeah? So you had that, and then you had the variant table at the end, so at least there was some overview. You might understand also that this is very hard to maintain. The next version comes out, and you have an additional requirement. First of all, this is Word, so if I insert an additional requirement somewhere where it makes sense, then everything changes after that. And then I need to the whole time refer between the variant table and the requirements that I have, and not every variant table has the same amount of requirements. So for a developer who looks at this and has to now implement all of these requirements and then make them available in software, this is a little bit of a nightmare. And it's a nightmare the first time, it's an even bigger nightmare the second time, because now you have a modified version of the document, and of course there is no way of figuring out what was modified, so you have to look through all of it and implement it. And the tables will be completely different and so on. So maybe not the best process. Which in a way is surprising, because the Ghent Workgroup exists very much of vendor users. That's true for ISO, it's also true at the Ghent Workgroup. There are lots of vendors who participate and who should know what is required to implement these things on the software side of things. But still, this is what we came up with. What we changed about that, and it by no means goes as far as what was talked about yesterday in the keynote, but I think it goes with the means that we have at the Ghent Workgroup, which is a relatively small group of people who volunteer their time. I think we make a step in that direction, perhaps. So if you would look at the 2022 specifications, what you have is no longer a single document that is very unstructured. What you now have is, and we did this in a spreadsheet because it was easiest for people to work with. It was easy for us to set up and maintain and so on. But what you have now is a list of, to begin with, definitions, something that we hardly did in previous versions of the specification. Yeah? So you have a list of definitions. And these definitions start at the very the very bottom, and they say, what is an element in a PDF file? What does that mean? And what is a page element? The difference between having something that is on the page and so will be printed and something that is not on a page. What is a visible element? What is a text element versus an image element? So there are lots and lots of definitions. And the reason that we make these definitions is because we need them afterwards to base requirements on. And we've tried to identify these definitions, to make them much more theoretically correct. And we've also tried to make them atomic in a way, so they build on top of each other. The downside of that is that if you want to understand what a black text element is, then you need to understand what the definition for black is. You need to understand what text element means, which probably refers to page element, which refers to element. So it might be that to understand something, you have to look through this list of definitions quite carefully, but you only have to do this once. They build on each other, and once you've understood that, you'll see these things come back in all of the requirements. And so the requirements are also much more structured. And they are now written in such a way that where possible, they refer to these definitions, which means that the text that you have in the requirements itself is much less complicated. I know it still looks complicated, but trust me, it's much less complicated than it was before. It's also much more accurate. There is much more room for discussion about what is going on. Even more importantly, both in the definitions and in the requirements that you have here, you can see that we work with IDs for all of these items, things that will never change regardless of whether we add something or not. The IDs don't change. We work with versions in there so that if something if we make a 2023 specification and 3 of these requirements change, then as an implementer, it will be very easy to see which one of those changed, and so which ones you need to look at and which ones remain the same, and you can be confident that nothing in that area was modified. So this is a much more structured format than what we did beforehand. And so when you look at the variant table, the list of all of the different variants that we create in 2022, that just now refers to the requirements and shows which of them are relevant for a particular variant, which are not. So you can see the difference between green, which means I don't care about this, orange or yellow, which says warning, this is a potential problem, and then error are the things that should be raised as an actual problem in production. And some of these require additional parameters, and then you can see the parameters in there as well. But again, this is a much more structured format. And the reason we did this was to make our life easier to maintain it, obviously, but also because as a, for example, software company who wants to implement these specifications, this makes life easier. And there is at least one software company who uses this format of the specification to automatically create the pre-flight profiles from there. So instead of having to hand code everything one by one, once they implement the requirements, and because of the way that this is presented in a very structured way, they can just take this and generate all of the different variant profiles that they need completely automatically. Is this the perfect way of doing things? No, I think some of the ideas I heard yesterday in the keynote go a lot further than this and would make a lot of sense. But I think for the level of the size of the organization that the Ghent Workgroup is and the amount of time that people can contribute to develop all of these things, that this is probably a first good step in that direction. And with that, I'll leave the 3 claims that hopefully now make a little bit more sense on here, and that was what I want to share. So thank you for listening, and if you have questions or want to disagree, I am open for discussion. Thank you.